about social media in your research question, you should be clear if you're asked, what do you mean by social media? So we might all agree that Twitter and Facebook are social media, but does WhatsApp count as social media? And there are various new technologies where it's not clear whether they fit into standard definitions. So you have to be clear about exactly what you mean, and you have to think about what all the words mean. The other thing you have to think about is, am I going to be able to collect the data that I need to answer this question? So I've said you need to be able to answer a question with evidence and data, and some data is harder to get than others. So for example, if you required to observe people to get your data, then that's more difficult than perhaps it is to give somebody a questionnaire or ask them to be involved in an interview. There are more ethical and practical difficulties. And the scale of the question is also important. So lots of students, when they first come to me, might have a question. I do things in education. They say, well, why is there a link between poverty and educational success? Now, that's a really interesting question, but hundreds and thousands of academics have been trying to answer it for 50 years. So it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to answer it as a master's student with very little resources and quite a limited time scale. So there's also a kind of, there's a practical element to what data will you need, where will you get it from, is it ethical and practical to collect that data, and will I have enough time and other resources to collect that data and answer that question. So there are various sort of levels to think about, going from at the very top, is this a question that can be answered with evidence, right the way down to the more practical end is the evidence that is needed something I can collect as a master's student who will be doing a dissertation in quite restricted circumstances. And of course, the pandemic makes research questions a little bit different because we are restricted in the kind of methods that we can use. So it's been quite interesting seeing what people have done with online methods. And I think there's been some imaginative and creative thinking. And of course, we can do things like interviews and questionnaires online, but things like observation might be more difficult. In practical terms, it's possible to observe somebody's social media, but that raises obviously ethical issues about permission, privacy, and things like that. So research questions in the pandemic might be slightly different to research questions normally because we have to think about things a little bit differently.
That's great. And what about, Patrick, what do you see as some of the key mistakes? I mean, maybe you've touched on some of them there, but you know, even your experience, what are some of the key mistakes that students make when developing research questions?
So I think the most obvious one, and I've touched on this, is being too ambitious. You really have to be a bit modest in your aspirations, and you're probably not going to be able to answer the question you really want to answer. You're probably going to have to answer a smaller or more modest version of that question. So academic knowledge is kind of cumulative. We all add our little bricks to the wall, and I'm sure Katie would agree with me that we'd all like to be making a bigger splash and having larger projects and things like that. But we have to be realistic about what we can do with the time and the resources we've got available. So that's the first one. The second one, and this is related, is having too many questions. So it's a good idea to have a list of questions at the beginning, but then to cut them down and say, which ones do I really need? And you'll find that some questions fit together quite nicely. They're smaller parts of a larger problem, or they can be answered with the same data set. So they might all be able to be answered with some focus group or interviews, or they might be able to be answered with a questionnaire survey. If you have too many questions, and especially if those questions require you to get different kinds of data using different kind of methods, then your research can get quite ungainly, it can get quite large and difficult to handle. And so that's something to avoid. So the questions themselves are often too ambitious. There are too many questions. And I think the last one is that people don't think through the consequences of those questions in terms of what data they need. So one of the key messages that I write about, the reason you spend a lot of time on research questions is to think about what data you need to answer them. And modifying them is often done because you think, oh, well, I'm not going to be able to get that data. I'll change my research question to make it more realistic. Now, if you just do your research questions and don't think about the data that you need, then you find out too late that it's impossible to get the data that you need. And then you're further down the road, you've got less time to make any changes. So I know people are really impatient to get on with their research and to go and collect the data and analyze it, because that's the really exciting bit. But it really does pay to spend time at the beginning thinking about your research questions, because that will pay off in the long run. That time where you think that you're not making any progress, you're actually doing some very important thinking about your research and what your research is going to look like. And that will be paid back many times over later in your research.
So that leads actually quite well, Patrick. So we've got this new cohort of students. I'm asking them from today to start thinking about research topics, research questions. What advice would you have for them, even on where to start and developing these research questions?
Okay, a really good way to start is just looking at what stories are in the news. So if you go onto any news websites, and this can be anywhere around the world, any news sites, you'll find what people are talking about and what are topical topics. And so that might give you some ideas, and it can give you some ideas in two ways. You might think, oh, people are talking about working virtually from home. And lots more people are working virtually from home now. So there are lots of questions that are related to that. Does this affect differently? What kind of people can work from home and what people can't? And what impact does that have on their lives? It has questions about infrastructure, access to the internet, rural and urban communities. It has links to things like mental health and how this is affecting people. How is interaction different? Do you get the same benefits interacting over a screen than you do face to face? It has implications for people's family life and childcare. It might have aspects on their physical health for sitting down too long, not walking to meetings, all sorts of things. So just one change like that, you can think of lots of different aspects that might be interesting. If you're doing something on advertising, for example, it might be that now we're spending longer in front of our screens, we're exposed to more advertising or different types of advertising. I read a very interesting proposal from your previous cohort, which was about the types of advertising that people were exposed to. Was it targeted towards their different needs in the pandemic? Were home exercise solutions being advertised? Were things to make you look better on a Zoom or Teams call, like lights or makeup, being targeted more? So there are all sorts of things. So I think the news is always a good place to start. Also, your personal experiences. So, you know, some of you will have had careers or be interested in pursuing certain careers. Some of you will have lived in particular family circumstances or particular parts of the country or the world. So you all have your own interesting biographies and your own interest. It might be something that you're interested in your leisure time, to do with music or film or literature or sport or anything like that. So any one of these kind of things could be interesting. So the first thing is the news and current affairs. The second thing is your own personal experiences and interests. And the last thing, of course, is what you've learned in your education. So when you've been studying media, or if you're studying media-related courses for the first time, what interests you when you're on your other modules? So don't only think about research methods when you're studying this module. Think about research ideas and research methods when you're studying your other modules, and think, what are people studying? What are they not studying? What are the areas that I'm studying in my other modules that interest me most? Because as you said, Katie, when you do your research project, eventually, this will be a big piece of work. So it's got to be something that you can remain interested in for quite a long time. So it's got to be something that you're passionate about and something that you can have a sustained interest. So don't worry about making it personal or something to do with you or your interests. That's usually a good thing.
That's great. And so I know, Patrick, in the past, I've had questions from students who ask, do they have to do research on topics in Britain or about Britain?
No, I think I think you can do something on something all, you know, anywhere around the world. Obviously, media is very different around the world. We know that social media platforms are very different around the world as well. So you might want to do something relating to your home country because you know more about it and because it's interesting. Or you might want to do something about a different country because it's new and interesting. But you can also do a comparative study where you might compare the UK with China, for example, or the US with the UK, or the US with China, and compare how different people from different societies are interacting with media or using media, or however it relates to the research that you're interested in.
So does that mean that you could do research in another language? You can carry out your research in another language?
Yes, you can carry out your research in a different language, but when you present it, you've got to translate any interviews or focus groups or questionnaires into English for your research project. So quite a lot of people every year do research in their own language, and that's perfectly fine. The only caveat is that this then has to be translated back when you submit your research project at the end of your project.
And what about, Patrick? So what if there's a really interesting piece of research that, say, has been done in Britain, but maybe I want to take that same project and do it in a different cultural context, geographic location, different group of people? Is that acceptable?
Yeah, that's fine. It's unlikely that you're going to do some research that is completely different to anything anybody has ever done before. So as long as your research isn't absolutely identical to something that's gone on before, then that's absolutely fine. In fact, it's a good idea to look at research that people have done that is quite similar. You can learn a lot about the literature, so it's a way into the literature. They'll have collected together relevant literature, and that'll start you off on your literature review. But also it's good to see what methods they've used and to look at what has worked and what hasn't worked. So sometimes professional researchers will write up their findings and they will say, we tried this and we don't think it worked that well, and next time we would do something differently. So you only have to change a little bit about the context. One thing will always be different. You'll be doing it at a different time. So things will have changed since that research was published anyway. Even if you try to replicate it exactly, you couldn't do it exactly because things have moved on. And there may be research in the UK, but that doesn't mean it's been done at Leicester. There may be research in Leicester, but it doesn't mean it's been done on students at the University of Leicester, if that's what you're interested in. So it's quite easy to take an idea that you find exciting and make some small changes to it, which means it's got sufficient originality that it's fine for your research project.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of support from staff, Patrick, what advice would you give to students? I mean, would you encourage them to say, do a research project without speaking to a supervisor or member of staff about their idea?
Well, you will be allocated a supervisor on the basis of your topic. So the idea is, when you put an idea in for a topic, we try and match you with somebody who is closest to that area in our expertise. But of course, we can't cover all areas, and there are only so many staff with particular expertise. So you will be given someone to help you all the way through. However, if it's a good idea, especially when you're new here, to have a look on our website at the staff that we have and what their interests are. And it's perfectly fine to contact members of staff and say, I've got an idea for a research project. Can I just run some ideas past you, perhaps on email at first, and then later on, by, you know, perhaps having a Teams meeting or a quick Zoom meeting or something like that. And you can request for somebody to be your supervisor if they've agreed that it's appropriate. We can't guarantee that you'll get them, but it's really a good idea to have a look at what we actually do in the school. And that might itself give you ideas about some areas for research that you haven't heard of before.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the same thing. I mean, even with assignment 2, I would really recommend to students not to pick a research topic or question that you haven't spoken to anyone about. So there'll be lots of opportunities to share your research topic or question with myself or with another member of staff, just to make sure that it's appropriate, that it's viable, that it's not too big, that you can access the data, basically to make sure that it's realistic. So take advantage of those opportunities. I usually come onto these team meetings about 10 minutes early, and that will be a chance too, if you just want to use that time to say, oh, Katie, this is what I'm interested in. What do you think? If you're not comfortable doing it on Teams, send me an email. I'm really happy to just, you know, provide my feedback on your research topic or research questions. And from next week, I will be asking you all to share them with me weekly, so that I can just feedback and let you know if it's an appropriate idea. The other thing I might say, actually, that I haven't mentioned is your research topic or question needs to be linked in some way to media and communication. Ideally to your major, but it needs to have some link to media and communication. So just really keep that in mind. In the past, I've had students who have proposed topics that have nothing to do with media or communication. So it really needs to have a link. That's great. So Gao Mei, I see you've got a question.
Yes, I want, if I want to know the perspective of all classes people between China and Britain about the block of President Trump's social media, what methods should I do to investigate and draw a more comprehensive and independent conclusion?
Okay, that's a great question. Patrick, do you want to have a go, or do you want me?
Sorry, I didn't hear. Can you repeat the question, Katie?
Yeah, so I think, Galme, if you allow me, I think you were asking if you're interested in looking at older people's perspective on Donald Trump and his Twitter accounts, what methods could be used? And this
between China and Britain.
Between China and Britain.
Various class, I mean different level people. Different class. Yes.
Different class. Okay, so different class of people.
Right. I mean,
block the Trump's.
I mean that That's quite a challenging one. I think that's something that you would have to think through. I'm not sure it's something we could come up with a solution, you know, in the next 5 minutes. But there are various strategies.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one obvious one would be to put a link to a survey on social media groups. So you could say, you could put some links on some groups within social media. So there may be groups on particular platforms that have people with particular jobs, for example, and you could link it on there. So I think the idea would be you would try and get as many people as possible to answer a general survey. And then within that survey...
do you think this is not a good project? It's too big for a student?
No, I don't think it's too big at all, because I think that you can do it in a particular way. I think you would have different social media platforms, say in the UK and China. You could put up a link to a survey which asks people not only about their views, but what kind of jobs they do and what education they've got and their age. So you could filter them afterwards. I think the challenge would be, and it's often the case with online surveys, is getting enough people to participate in it. So I think the thing that you'd have to think creatively about is, how do I get this out to as many people as possible? And I think that would involve what you know, is sometimes called snowballing. So you get people to fill it in and then distribute it, the link, to other people in their network who distribute that to wider networks. So I think identifying places on social media to publicize it in the first place would be the key to the kind of success. But I don't think it's too ambitious. I think it's an interesting idea for a project, but I think it's something that would need to be thought through carefully before you actually started collecting data. It would be something that would need a bit of strategy and a bit of careful planning, but I think it's definitely possible, and I think it's you can do it online, so it's definitely the sort of thing that you could do for a project on this kind of degree.
Yeah, that's really great. And maybe, because I know we're running out of time, so I might just finish by saying this is the exciting thing about research methods, is there's so many different ways you could do that topic, with surveys, with interviews, with focus groups, different sampling strategies like Patrick's talked about. And that's the whole point of this course, is we're going to teach you different ways that you can go and collect this data about the world around you. Okay, on that note, I'd just like to finish by thanking Patrick so much for joining us and sharing his wisdom and insight about research questions. I know some of you have another module to go to, so you can feel free to leave. I'm going to hang around for a little bit just in case anyone has any final questions. Lovely to meet you all. I look forward to seeing you all next Friday, not Tuesday, for our next session. Okay, thanks everyone so much.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Thanks, Patrick. That was great.
That's fine.
Bye.